Late November 1812. Imagine thousands of soldiers wandering through the snow, barefoot, hungry, frozen. They flee, they fall, they die, not under enemy bullets, but under the blows of the wind and the cold. This is the Berezina, a river turned into a grave, a name synonymous with total defeat. This is where the Napoleonic epic descends into horror. And what if I told you that all of this could have been avoided? That this disaster, much more than a military blunder, might be the result of overconfidence, of fatal blindness? Stay until the end of the video, because you'll discover how the most powerful man in Europe was betrayed, not by his enemies, but by nature itself. To understand the debacle of 1812, we must first return to where it all began, in 1789. That year, France erupts. The revolution sweeps away the monarchy, privileges, and the established order. Heads roll, literally. Louis XVI is guillotined in 1793, followed by Queen Marie Antoinette. Robespierre imposes the terror. France changes completely, and amidst this chaos, a generation of young officers emerges, without noble titles, but filled with newfound ambition. Among them, Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican barely 24 years old. The son of a poor nobleman, Napoleon is far from an heir to the court, but he quickly understands the system's weaknesses. A brilliant strategist, he gains recognition during the Siege of Toulon in 1793. From that point, everything accelerates. In 1796, he leads the historic Italian campaign with lightning success. He crushes the Austrian powers and imposes peace. Then, in 1798, he sets off for Egypt. The expedition is a military failure, but a political triumph. He returns to Paris as a hero, a providential figure in a France weary of conspiracies and quarrels. The following year, he overthrows the Directory in a coup. The famous 18th Brumaire. He becomes first consul. From then on, he reorganizes France. Creation of the Bank of France, civil code, concordat with the church, reform of administration and education. He restores order, silences factions, and brings France a stability it has not known for years. But he does not want to share this power. In 1804, he has himself crowned emperor at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, in the presence of Pope Pius VII. A coronation where he places the crown on his own head, a symbol. He is not chosen by God, but by himself, by force. From that moment onward, Napoleon would go on to change Europe's destiny. Between 1805 and 1809, he defeats almost all the great powers of the continent. Austerlitz, against the Russians and Austrians, is his masterpiece. In a single day, he dismantles the Third Coalition. In 1706, he crushes Prussia at Jena, and the following year he defeats the Russians at Friedland and signs the Treaty of Tilsit with Tsar Alexander III, a fragile alliance based on fear rather than trust. Napoleon now reigns over a Europe reshaped in his image. His brothers become kings. Joseph in Naples, then in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. But the empire is vast and unstable. In Spain, the guerrilla war drags on. In Germany, nationalists grumble. In Russia, Alexander I's pride simmers. Above all, there is England, which has never yielded. Protected by its navy, it continues to fund coalitions against Napoleon. So Napoleon strikes where it hurts, the economy. He imposes the Continental blockade on all of Europe, a ban on trading with England. The objective, to strangle it economically. But the blockade is costly, very costly, for French ports, but also for allied countries. And little by little, cracks begin to appear. In 1810, Alexander decides to discreetly reopen his ports to British ships. Officially, it's to revive his economy. Unofficially, it's a challenge to Napoleon. Obsessed with total control, Napoleon sees this as a betrayal. The tension becomes unbearable. Both sides prepare for a rupture. Napoleon could have sought a compromise. He could have renegotiated the terms of the blockade, avoided the conflict, but he is incapable of doing so. Since Austerlitz, he has won all his wars. He is convinced that force alone is enough to persuade. He believes that an invasion will be sufficient to bring Alexander back to the negotiating table. He begins to mobilize a gigantic army, the largest ever seen in Europe. Dozens of nations under his dominion are called upon. French, but also Italians, Dutch, Germans, Poles, Croats, Spanish, all gathered under his sole command. The history of Europe, no, of the world, is about to change. It is in this context that, on June 24th, 1812, at the first light of day, Napoleon crosses the Niemen River at the head of more than 600,000 men. His objective is simple: to force Alexander to capitulate quickly by winning a major battle, as he has always done. A 3-week campaign and peace will be concluded in Moscow, he says. But this time, the opponent does not play by his rules, and instead of a swift victory, Napoleon will walk into a colossal trap. From the very first days, the Russians retreat, avoiding direct confrontation. Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration implement a radical strategy, the scorched earth tactic. They burn villages, crops, and supply depots. The Grande Armée advances, but conquers only ruins. The heat is overwhelming. Soldiers die of thirst, disease, and exhaustion. Horses collapse by the thousands. Yet Napoleon presses on. He wants to force the Russians into battle. He sets his sights on Smolensk, a fortified city, and a strategic crossroads. On August 16th, he launches an assault on the city. The fighting is fierce. Once again, the Russians withdraw. This time, the emperor begins to doubt. He has won neither a decisive battle nor a capitulation, only ashes. And his army, already reduced by half, stretches dangerously through a land it does not understand. On September 14th, 1812, Napoleon finally enters Moscow. He expects a solemn welcome, a delegation from the Tsar, perhaps even a surrender. But the city is silent, empty, ghostly. Of more than 250,000 inhabitants, only a few thousand remain, too poor or too old to flee. The Russians have evacuated the capital, taking supplies and destroying the wells. The first hours are calm. Napoleon settles into the Tsar's palace at the Kremlin. He waits for a message from Alexander I. It will never come. Then, on the night of September 15th to 16th, the sky ignites. Flames rise across the city. Explosions echo. Warehouses, rooftops, churches, everything burns. Moscow burns for 6 days. The fire is uncontrollable. Rostopchin, governor of Moscow, is suspected of orchestrating this systematic destruction. Faced with this scorched, unlivable city, the army begins to fall apart, looting, drunkenness, disease. The men grow bored and waste away. Napoleon waits for a letter that never arrives. On October 23rd, 1812, Napoleon gives in and orders the retreat from Moscow. For more than a month, he has waited for a sign from the Tsar. Nothing has come. Not an envoy, not a letter, not an outstretched hand. The emperor thus decides to retreat, hoping to reach his supply lines and return to Poland. But the army is now only a shadow of its former self. The march resumes in a grim silence. The wind is already blowing. The cold sets in. The first snowflakes fall before the end of October. Napoleon attempts to bypass the Russian army by heading further south, toward Kaluga. But at Maloyaroslavets, the Russians stop him abruptly. The battle is fierce and indecisive. Napoleon retreats. He is forced to take the same route back as he came the road to Smolensk, already devastated. It is a death sentence. Winter falls suddenly. On November 6th, snow blankets everything. The temperature plummets to minus 20 degrees Celsius, then to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Exhausted and starving, soldiers collapse into the snow, never to rise again. Entire regiments vanish. Horses, cannons, and wagons are abandoned. Even rifles become useless, frozen solid. Men drink water from puddles, eat bark, and fight over scraps of horse meat. Some descend into madness, others give up, sit down, and never rise again. Russian Cossacks harass them relentlessly, striking mercilessly, capturing, massacring the stragglers. They are no longer seeking a battle, only destruction. The chaos is so great that even Napoleon is no longer safe. One day, in total confusion near Krasnoye, he strays from his guard, riding a small sleigh. Suddenly, a detachment of Russian Cossacks appears. They spot him, surround him, weapons drawn. For a moment, the emperor is seconds away from being captured or killed. He is accompanied only by a Polish officer and 2 cavalrymen. By a miracle, the old guard arrives, just in time. The Cossacks scatter. Napoleon is narrowly saved. At Smolensk, the army tries to regroup. But the city, stormed just weeks earlier, is empty, without supplies. Hope fades. A witness, Marshal Ney, writes in his letters, "It was no longer an army, but a mob of naked, starving men dragging their frozen limbs." The peak of horror comes at the Berezina between November 26th and 29th. The Russians close the trap. The river is high, icy, and impassable. Napoleon improvises. He orders the construction of 2 bridges using the remnants of his military engineers. Under Russian fire, thousands of men plunge into the waters. The panic is indescribable. The screams, the explosions, the horses carried away by the current. Many drown. Others are trampled or fall into the void, but Napoleon passes. After the Berezina, nothing remains. What was once the most powerful army in Europe is now a column of survivors. Men without weapons, without uniforms, burned by frost, ravaged by hunger, unable to speak. On December 5th, Napoleon secretly leaves the army. He boards a sleigh, heading for Paris. He must save the image of the empire. To his marshals, he leaves a famous note.
Il faut que la France sache que l'empereur est vivant.
France must know that the emperor is alive. Command passes to Murat, then to Eugène de Beauharnais, but no one has control anymore. On December 30th, the last troops cross the Niemen in icy silence. Russia is behind them. But this campaign will forever seal France's fate. 600,000 men entered Russia. Fewer than 50,000 returned. It is an unprecedented human disaster. The losses are staggering. But the most significant loss is Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The peoples of Europe now know it. Prussia rises. Austria breaks the alliance. Russia calls for vengeance. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition is formed. A year later, Paris falls. Napoleon abdicates. The emperor who had dominated Europe is exiled to the island of Elba. But his ambition still burns. We will discover this in a future account. The Russian campaign was far more than a military disaster. It was a collapse, a tragedy. General Winter broke the French Empire, just as it would shatter Hitler's dreams of grandeur nearly 130 years later. Overconfidence blinds. This was Napoleon's bitter realization. Standing atop Europe led the emperor to let his guard down and make mistakes of immeasurable cost. If this dive into Napoleon's historic campaign in Russia captivated you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the great moments from the past. To support my work, leave a like and share the video. By the way, tell me in the comments, could Napoleon have defeated Russia? Or did he make an irreparable mistake from the very start? See you very soon for another journey into the heart of history.